Hello, and welcome to the virtual launch of A Killing in Van Diemen's Land. My name is Gavin McDougall from Lewis Press. I'm delighted to welcome Douglas Watt from the wilds of Midlothian out in Pathhead tonight. So A Killing in Van Diemen's Land is the fifth in the John Mackenzie historical crime series. So the series has been moving through the years. So the first in the series started in 1686 with Death of a Chief. Then it moved on to 1687 with Testament of a Witch, 1688 with Pilgrim of Slaughter, 1689 with The Unnatural Death of a Jacobite. So now we've arrived at 1690 and A Killing in Van Diemen's Land. Just to give you a little flavour of the book, it's Edinburgh, it's 1690. Jacob Kerr, a wealthy city merchant and church elder, has been found stabbed to death in his own home. Is it a routine robbery gone wrong? Or, as the evidence suggests, John Mackenzie's dragged from happy retirement to the irresistible pull of a murder that is not as simple as it seems? So you've got John Mackenzie, the investigating advocate, and his sidekick, Davy Scougal. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Douglas in a second. Douglas is going to speak for 20-30 minutes about the book, maybe give us a little reading from it, and then there'll be 10-15 minutes for questions, comments, and so on. So that'll be the format for tonight. So over to you, Douglas.
That's great. Thanks very much, Gavin, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the 17th century. Thanks for logging in tonight. I know it's slightly unusual book launch, but hopefully we'll be back to face-to-face book launches fairly soon. I just wanted, before I started, just to kind of reiterate the fact that it's quite an unusual time. So bookshops are shut just now, and we can't obviously sell books tonight at the launch. So if anyone wants to buy a copy, please log on to the Lewis website and order a copy of the book. And if you enjoy it, please leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads. That would be really helpful. But before I start tonight, I just want to thank a few people who've helped the book come into being. First of all, Julie, my long-suffering wife. The book's dedicated to her. Thanks for the love and support. Thank you to all my children, Jamie, Robbie, and Katie, and their partners, Izzy, Laura, and Connor. And thanks to everyone at Lewis for getting the book out. Gavin in particular, also Maya Gentle and Carrie Hutchison on the production side, and Laura and Grieve for organising the event tonight. As Gavin mentioned, this will be really a standard book launch, with the only difference being my head will appear much bigger than previous book launches, and you won't see my legs. I'll have a quick chat about the book, and then I'll talk about the historical period, the 1690s, and then open up to Q&A. So please, if you've got any particular questions that that spring to mind when I'm talking, just fire them through in the chat function, and later on I'll come back and try and answer all the questions. Well, A Killing in Van Diemen's Land. It's the fifth in a series of historical crime thrillers set in late 17th century Scotland, featuring John Mackenzie, an Edinburgh advocate of Highland origins, and his sidekick Davy Scougal, who's a young notary public from Musselburgh, just down the coast from Edinburgh. The books are first and foremost standalone crime stories, but they're also part of a journey through a relatively unknown period in Scottish history, the 1680s and 1690s, a fascinating but paradoxical time of witch hunts, blasphemy trials, religious fundamentalism, which also saw the origins of science and the beginning of the Enlightenment. The books are set in consecutive years, so I think Gavin mentioned the first one, Death of a Chief, about the murder of a Highland chief in Edinburgh, is set in the year 1686, and with the fifth book, A Killing in Van Diemen's Land, we've reached the year 1690. So what can we say about Scotland and, in fact, Edinburgh, where the book's set in 1690? I think 1690, to characterise it, we would say it's a time of major uncertainty for people in Edinburgh. People are still coming to terms with a major historical event 2 years previously, the Revolution of 1688, which ousted King James II of England and 7th of Scotland from the throne, and paved the way for William and Mary to become king and queen. It bitterly divided Scotland, England, and Ireland, and a bitter political division is one of the legacies of that revolution. And even in 1690, people were still trying to come to terms with that event, and society is very divided between Jacobites who support the restoration of King James, or the continuity of King James as king, and Williamites who support the new regime of William and Mary. In 1690, the outcome of this revolution is still not certain. So we're still in this kind of process of revolution and a time of great uncertainty. Although William and Mary control most of England and lowland Scotland, Ireland is in a state of turmoil, and King James is leading an army in Ireland. And just as the book, or just before the book in fact starts, in June 1690, William arrives in Ireland with a huge army as well. So Ireland is in this state of chaos. The Highlands of Scotland are also troubled, although the Jacobites have faced many setbacks since the amazing victory they had at Killiecrankie in 1689. There's still expectations among some of the chiefs that the struggle will continue. As a result, for Edinburgh citizens, they're pretty uncertain about the future. They're anxious, and this anxiety spills over into paranoia. So one of the backgrounds of the book is just this division and uncertainty. But the other major area of uncertainty, which is to the fore in A Killing in Van Diemen's Land, we might describe as religious or philosophical uncertainty. People, both in their private houses and in coffee houses and in taverns and inns in public, are debating some pretty big issues. You know, is there a God? Does God exist? What's the nature of the devil? Does the devil exist? Is there a spirit world? And we're seeing new currents in religious thought, like deism, which is challenging the view of the Bible as this source of authority, and also challenging ideas like the Trinity. And at one extreme, this has spilled over into pure atheism, and people are denying the existence of God. So this is a radical change, a period of free thinking, especially in the 1690s. And for many, this is very exciting and anticipates the Enlightenment of the next century. But for a large number of Scots, it's a real challenge, and it's a very threatening period, and their worldview is being challenged on a number of fronts. And so some of these tensions will eventually come to will kind of boil over and come to a peak a few years later in 1696 with the famous or infamous Thomas Aikenhead blasphemy case, when a young Edinburgh student is found guilty of blasphemy on evidence from his fellow students, and is executed for blasphemy. And he's actually the last person to be executed in Britain for blasphemy. So we've got political divisions in Edinburgh. We've got a real a fervent of new ideas unsettling people. And we've also got the geography of Edinburgh itself, which, if you think in the 1690s, there's no new town, so everyone's crammed together in the old town, in the tenements and wynds and closes off the high street. It's very congested. There's high tenements. People are very close together. It's difficult to escape people. It's still there's a lot of nosy neighbours about. And I think this intense atmosphere, this intense pressure cook atmosphere, has a big influence on people's, we would describe it now as mental health, but in the 17th century, they would talk about their spiritual health. So these are some of the themes that the book explores. This book, which is a wee bit different from the previous books, is very much anchored in one location. And that location is a house in Edinburgh called Van Diemen's Land. It's owned by a wealthy Edinburgh merchant called Jacob Kerr, who is found brutally murdered in the house one day. The house, Van Diemen's Land, is really a character in the book itself, I would say. and it's very loosely based on a real house in Edinburgh. Some of you may know Gladstone's Land on the Lawn Market, the top kind of part of the High Street, which is now run by the National Trust. Well, Van Diemen's Land is a similar building. It's not on the High Street. It's in a quiet courtyard to the north of the Lawn Market, down a very long, narrow vennel. John Mackenzie feels that he's never actually been in this courtyard before in his life. He's got a kind of memory of maybe he staggered down there one drunken night when he's a young advocate, but he's certainly never been inside any of the houses in the courtyard. At first, Mackenzie is reluctant to take on this case of a killing in Van Diemen's Land because he fears he's being set up to lose. The Lord Advocate, Dalrymple of Stair, has asked him to look after this because he's very busy on political business, trying to see legislation through Parliament to establish Presbyterianism. But once Mackenzie accepts the case and he crosses the threshold of Van Diemen's Land, he finds himself in a household where a number of these anxieties and pressures are manifest. A household afflicted by fear and uncertainty, belief and doubt, ecstasy and despair. And the case goes in a slightly different direction from the one that he had expected. I'm just going to read a couple of short extracts from the book. The first extract is early on, before Mackenzie has actually gone into the house. If you imagine he is in the Lawn Market of Edinburgh, which is up at the top of the High Street, and he's looking down a narrow vennel to the north, and he can see a black door in the distance. This is the door of Van Diemen's Land, and he's pondering what's happened behind that door. Mackenzie walked down the vennel ponderously, listening to his own footsteps, observing the damp stone of the walls of the tenements on both sides, noticing how they leaned together as they rose story after story, until 7 stories above, they were little more than a couple of feet apart, and only a thin rectangle of blue sky was visible. It was like walking through a long, peaked cave. Another thing struck him as he proceeded. The vennel was relatively free of clart by Edinburgh standards. Most closest vennels and wines in the city hit the nose immediately on entry due to the mixture of ordure and shit dumped from the windows above. Coburn's wine was clear of the usual detritus and looked like it was regularly swept. It was a well-ordered corner in the chaos of the city. At the bottom, he entered a small courtyard, Cummings Court, also kept clean, around which a number of tenements or lands were built. On the north side, Henderson's Land and Van Diemen's Land conjoined, each the mirror image of the other, with Cunningham's Land in the east and Lermouth Land on the west. To the south, a high wall obscured the rigs of the buildings on the High Street. 2 tiny passageways on the sides of Henderson's Land and Van Diemen's Land led north to the rear of the buildings and the rigs, and then to an overgrown slope that dropped steeply to the Nor Loch, the area of stagnant water and marsh in the north of Edinburgh, as it acted as a defensive barrier over the centuries. It was a fine, cloudless day, but little sunlight warmed the cobbles in the courtyard because of shadows cast by the tenements. It was a forgotten corner of the city that Mackenzie had hardly ever passed through, despite living in Edinburgh for most of his adult life. Perhaps he had staggered down the Vennel after a late-night drinking session as a young advocate, but he had never visited any of the houses in the courtyard. Mackenzie stood before the door of Van Diemen's Land. Apart from the exotic name, there was little out of the ordinary about the house. It was a typical merchant's dwelling of 5 stories and a basement, narrow and tall, with crow-step gables in the Dutch manner. His eyes took in the sash windows on each floor, clean and well attended. The lintel above the door was carved with the coat of arms of Van Diemen and gave the year of the building's construction as 1627. He calculated for a moment. Van Diemen's Land was 63 years old, 8 years older than he was. It was in a good state of repair. The door was spotless and freshly painted in black. The stonework well pointed. It was a tidy dwelling place, exhibiting order and the wealth of its dead owner. It was such an ordinary Edinburgh scene, a merchant's dwelling house off the high street. He could hear the distant hum of the lawn market, merchants, tradesmen, artisans, street boys going about their business. He hesitated to knock on the door. Everything appeared calm from outside in the courtyard. But once he passed through the threshold, not as a friend of the house, but investigator of a killing, things might not be so serene. He would have to ask uncomfortable questions of those who lived behind the door. But he was used to such things after a lifetime in the law, and he relished a bit of trouble. Well, the investigation proceeds once Mackenzie has been into the house, and he finds out more about Jacob Kerr, the man who's been killed, who, as well as being a wealthy merchant in the cloth trade, is a Kirk elder and a member of the Kirk Session. Now, the Kirk Session was a court in the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, which was involved with trying to control the morality of people in the parish, and it would, for example, take witchcraft cases, etc. It's not to be confused with the Court of Session, which is the main civil court in Scotland, which John Mackenzie worked in as clerk of the court. Both these courts are mentioned in the following section. Mackenzie has, he wants to interview the minister who sits with Jacob Kerr on the Kirk Session, and this takes him out of Van Diemen's Land, back down the high street of Edinburgh, down towards St Giles Kirk, which is obviously still there today. It's a slightly diminished area today, but in 1690, the tall booth sits in front of it, a large stone building, which was the old Heart of Midlothian, described by Walter Scott, but which was a prison, a council chamber, and around the tall booth and the kirk were the Lucken booths, a number of, in fact, a large number of shops and booths where you could buy, lots of things and anything under the sun, from a book to a golf club. The next section I'm going to read is when Mackenzie enters St Giles Kirk. Mackenzie found the atmosphere in St Giles oppressive, and the silence spoke to him of the joyless message of Scottish Protestantism. He shook his head at the stools of repentance where sinners were humiliated for transgressions from blasphemy to fornication, and the long, uncomfortable pews where parishioners sat for hours as self-righteous preachers thundered against the pleasures of the world. Mackenzie detested the rigid certainties and cant of Presbyterians. In Edinburgh, he never went to church on the Sabbath. Although attendance was compulsory, he ignored the summons. He had felt obliged to show face when younger, but he had lapsed after a few years. An elder had once demanded he go. He had refused politely while cursing him in a stream of Gaelic invective. He was lucky, as a well-to-do lawyer related to an earl. He could ignore the admonitions of elders below him in status. Other parishioners were not so lucky. They were forced to attend every week, sometimes dragged from their hearths to face the cold strictures of the Reformed faith. Mackenzie was directed to an office at the side of the church by a beadle. He knocked on the low door and opened it immediately. The minister, Andrew Sharp, was working at a desk. He did not look pleased to be interrupted. Without raising his wigged head, Sharp snapped, "What is it now, Spence?" before realising he was not speaking to the church official. "I beg your pardon, sir. I'm trying to write my sermon. I've had too many interruptions already today." "I'll not keep you long, Mr. Sharp. I'm John Mackenzie." "I recognise you, sir." Sharp put down his pen and eyed Mackenzie coldly. "I was clerk of the session until recent changes. I have a few questions, if you'll allow me." Mackenzie shut the door behind him. "I'm working on a case for Dalrymple." "The killing of Mr. Kerr?" the minister asked seriously, rising to shake Mackenzie's hand before beckoning him to sit in front of the desk. "The advocate is so busy with parliamentary business, he's forced to employ me," said Mackenzie. Sharp sat back and smiled. A look of self-righteousness spread across his face. "These are historic days for this kingdom, Mr. Mackenzie. We've waited long for deliverance from the yoke of prelacy. We don't want anything upsetting the apple cart at the last moment. The advocate does vital work. Parliament must establish presbytery on a legal basis." Sharp's arrogant tone got under Mackenzie's skin. He just could not contain his dislike of men of the cloth, especially followers of Calvin. "What's the king's view of it all?" he asked provocatively. "You refer to King William, Mr. Mackenzie?" Sharp asked gravely. "Of course, Mr. Sharp. I believe the previous incumbent struggles in exile." "King William looks favourably on it," said Sharp. "He knows the existing religious settlement undermined the social harmony of the country, causing rebellion after rebellion in the southwest. The king wants nothing to distract him from the struggle on the continent. The battle with Antichrist will be long and bloody. King Louis must be destroyed." Sharp nodded to himself before continuing. "The Scots do not like bishops, Mr. Mackenzie. This land will not be at peace until they're sent packing." Another self-satisfied smile lingered in Sharp's face. "You may be right, Mr. Sharp, but forcing clergy from their homes is surely unwise. A host of desperate curates now follow the Jacobites. The people demand retribution for atrocities committed by Dundee. Many innocents were slain across Dumfriesshire and Galloway. The parishioners drive out those who sided with oppression. It's often the way at times of great change." Mackenzie smothered his anger by rubbing together the thumb and forefinger of his left hand. He felt himself relax and returned the preacher's smile as he moved the conversation back to the matter at hand. There was no point in arguing about politics with a Presbyterian. "As I was saying, Mr. Sharp, I'm here regarding Jacob Kerr's death. I believe he was an elder." Sharp nodded grimly, "A pious and long-serving one who attended the session regularly. He was always a solid presence in our meetings, did his duty, and was an example to others." "How was he perceived in the kirk?" Mackenzie asked. "As a good and honest man, sir. As a hard-working merchant who had prospered in the cloth trade. As a devoted husband and father who led a quiet life in the service of the Lord. He did not seek office in the church, but had to be persuaded to the position of elder. He served God quietly, humbly. He provided generous funds to charity. I believe he preferred a private life with his family." Mackenzie recalled the images of Kerr in the portraits in Van Diemen's Land. He found it difficult to equate the man described by the minister with the one on the walls of the house. "Where did he stand in the church, Mr. Sharp? Did he tend towards the fanatics?" The minister shook his head, aggrieved with the question. "I would not use that word to describe the more enthusiastic of our church, sir. Kerr was not active in that way. He was not involved with any of the sectaries. He was a good, steady Presbyterian. He was staunchly anti-papist, of course. He had no truck with Antichrist. I would put him firmly in the middle of the fold. Indeed, I believe I never heard him talk on the subject of church politics in all the years I knew him. He wanted presbytery and despised papists like most Scots. He didn't need to say much more about it, nor did he." "What about his work in the session? Was he active in rooting out sin in the parish?" asked Mackenzie. The minister was about to reply, but stopped himself for a moment and sat back, observing Mackenzie with displeasure. "I don't like the tone of your questions, sir. Kerr was not the most vocal in the session. As I've said, he attended regularly and rarely objected to decisions. And all the time I knew him, he always voted the same way as me. He was a loyal servant of the session. He was a loyal servant of the Lord. Then he might be described as a yes man, added Mackenzie sardonically. He was, if you put it like that. There was a hint of anger in Sharp's voice, which rose in volume as he continued. He said yes to fighting blasphemy and yes to punishing sin. I would say rather he was an exemplary Christian, caused no man in this world any trouble. I've heard it said he always acted fairly in business. I've never heard a man say a bad word about him. What about any woman? Asked Mackenzie, letting the question linger. Thanks very much. Well, now I'll open it up to questions. So please fire in on the chat function any questions at all about the book, about 1690, Scottish history, crime fiction, anything under the sun. And halfway through the questions will stop for the highlight of the night, the draw. Those who pre-ordered a book have been automatically entered into a prize-winning draw of new editions of the first 4 books in the series. So here we have a question here. What was it about the 17th century that drew you to setting the series in that period? Yeah, I've been asked that a few times, and it's kind of a strange question why it was so appealing. I think many years ago, I thought about doing medieval history and doing research in that period, but then I discovered my Latin was fairly useless, so I had to give up. But the 17th century has always appealed to me since I really first read anything about history. When I was about 18 or 19, I read a book by John Preble, quite a well-known popular historian, about Glencoe. And up until that point, my reading had mostly been, the usual teenage varieties: Arthur C. Clarke, James Herbert, The Rats, and so on. And then I read this book by Preble. I thought, my God, this is actually more interesting than the horror and the science fiction that I've been reading up until now. And I was really hooked on that period, especially the Massacre of Glencoe was such a fascinating subject. And ever since then, I've really been drawn to the 17th century. I think it's a mixture of the strange and the uncertain, these things like witchcraft and the fundamentalism of the religious position, which is very different from modern Scotland, but at the same time, we can see the beginnings of the modern world and the rise of science and the more tolerant views of the Enlightenment. And that clash makes it very interesting. And sometimes within the same individual, you can find someone who belongs to the old order and the new, witch hunters who are also company directors and political radicals who are also virulently anti-Catholic. So I think for a number of reasons, the 17th century is a fascinating period. The next question is from Matt. That first question was from Catherine. Thanks, Catherine, for that question. I can see who it's coming through from. What's Scougal up to in this book? Is he becoming less rigid in his belief? Yeah, well, I think Scougal is changing. I think when he began the series in 1686, he was quite a young man, a bit naive, and a bit green around the gills. And I think his experiences with Mackenzie have gradually thawed him a wee bit. He's still a bit naive. I mean, he comes from a different tradition from Mackenzie. Mackenzie's a Gaelic-speaking Highlander, an Episcopalian who comes from a slightly different tradition. Scougal's a lowland Presbyterian who is pretty sceptical about things in the Highlands, and a lot of his views are challenged in every book. His views of the Highlands were challenged in the Death of the Chief. His views about witchcraft were challenged in the Testament of the Witch. His views about radical politics were challenged in the Pilgrim's Slaughter, and his views about Jacobitism in the last book. So I think he is maturing, and he's been forced to kind of to mellow the rigidity of his views. And in that sense, I think he maybe represents a kind of journey that Presbyterian Scotland was going through at that period. In this book, I don't want to spoil it too much, but he is some major developments in his personal life have occurred, which will change him further. And I probably can mention that he's changed jobs, so his professional life has changed quite radically. If you remember in previous books I would have read about him, David Scrooge was a notary public, and he's got a small office in the across the road from St Giles Kirk, and he spends his days on land transactions, writing instrumentation after instrumentation. It's quite a dull job, and he's switched from that. He's joined an office, the office of Mrs. Hare, who was a major character in the Unnatural Death of a Jacobite, and he's now moved on to money lending and trade finance, and he's enjoying himself immensely with the prospect of distant travel to places like Falkirk and Glasgow awaiting him. So his career and his character are developing as the series goes. I'll move on to another question. Did you find writing a book based in one location to be more intense? I think I did, yeah. I'd always quite a fan of the kind of crime novel set in one location, whether it's the classic Agatha Christie upper class English manor house story, or I suppose if you're watching TV, Death in Paradise on some beautiful island. There's something quite interesting about that enclosed community, and a very much a focus on that. And yeah, I think I had the idea for the book maybe just walking around the high street myself one day, and was up beside Gladstone's Land, and then kind of looked down one of the Vennels round about there, and had a kind of flash of John Mackenzie standing there looking down at this house and not really knowing what's going on in there, but perhaps feeling the darkness. And this is a pretty dark story. I have to warn you, what's been going on inside that house is pretty brutal. But it was quite intense writing it, and but yeah, I enjoyed that format of crime novel very much. Right, here's another question. How do you deal with the different languages spoken in Scotland in the 17th century? This is quite a big question, and quite a difficult one. First, we have to say that the linguistic picture in 17th century Scotland is quite a complicated one. Gaelic is spoken much more, or by many more of the population, and the spread is much wider across the whole of the Gaelic, the Gaeltacht and the Highlands, and some pockets outside it. And there's also a kind of large bilingual area between the Highlands and Lowlands. You've also got all the dialects of Scots, which are spoken, across the Lowlands. Scots was the language of government in the late 16th century, but this is changing during the 17th century. And you've also got standard English, or regarded as 17th century English, spoken by quite large numbers of people, and French, and add in a bit of Latin as well, which a large number of the elite would speak. So it's quite a complicated picture to portray in crime fiction. And I think in earlier books in the series, I maybe tried to kind of put too much linguistic material in, and there was more Gaelic and more Scots, and the feedback from readers was kind of mixed. Some people liked it, and some people were completely bamboozled by the 17th century Scots. So in my view, genre fiction, crime fiction, the major aim is to actually probably get the reader through the book and get them through the narrative. So you don't want to put them off too much. So maybe I've scaled back the variety of language a wee bit in more recent books, and I'm trying to kind of just hint about the linguistic complexity of 17th century Scotland. Mackenzie is obviously a Gaelic speaker, and Scugel is really a Scots speaker, but I'm tending more just to hint at that in the books. Initially, Scoogle is very prejudicial against the Gaelic spoken by Mackenzie, but that changes as the books go on. And I suppose actually I'm actually writing another book just now, and in some ways the complexity increases even more when you move over to Ireland or involve Irish characters who are speaking Irish Gaelic, which is pretty similar to Scottish Gaelic in the 17th century. But it's a very fascinating subject. I'm sure academics will know a lot more about it than me. But I think literary fiction is probably the avenue to explore it more than crime fiction. Thanks very much. Here we go. Are you happy with the decision to write consecutive years, or do you sometimes wish you could jump ahead a few years to a particular event in history? Yeah, but both yes and no. I've got a great affection and great interest in the Darien disaster. For those who know, it's a major colonial attempt by the Scots in the late 17th century. So I've got a few years until I can get to that. But I quite like the rigid structure a wee bit, because it kind of anchors you in a kind of a structure of narrative for each book. And I've tended to explore different themes in each book. So once you've got that skeleton of history, you can then explore it through the characters. So I quite enjoy that. And I also feel that because I've got 1 year after the other, you're kind of getting this journey through an age, a historical period, which hopefully, as it goes, will be quite an interesting discussion of history in late 17th century Scotland. And the big themes behind that are quite major themes. What one is this transition, which this book is very much about, from fundamentalism to a fracturing of that, and the new thinking that comes as part of the Enlightenment, which all these books are about. And the other one is the rise of capitalism, in which more traditional societies, the clan-based society of the Highlands, gradually gives way to a more commercial society, and then what we would regard as a capitalist society. So I think those themes, will take the stories all the way down. But I agree, it is a bit of a straitjacket. But you can also, there is scope to kind of have flashbacks from, for example, from 1691 back to the previous areas. I also think once having started this, I'm just going to keep going with it as long as it'll go, because if I suddenly 10 years into the future, it might confuse people. Thanks very much for the question. That was an interesting one. Here's another question. Do you consider your novels part of the horror genre as much as crime fiction? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I would agree with that, because I think that the 17th century is a Gothic century in that sense. I mean, it's the subjects that it deals with: belief in the devil, Satan, darkness, death, anxieties, uncertainties, are all fairly kind of Gothic issues. And I was always, very interested. Well, I always liked the horror genre as a young boy and kind of teenager. It always drew me to it. So I would certainly say that some of these books do move into the horror genre. I think certainly the witchcraft one I would regard as a crime book and a horror book. Possibly Pilgrim of Slaughter as well. Not so much the Jacobite one. And yeah, this one is certainly it's a tense, hopefully a tense crime book, but also a dark horror story of the horrors that people can inflict upon each other. Thanks for that question. Any hankering to see your series of books being dramatised? Which Scottish actor will fit well as Mackenzie? Yeah, we'd love to see them dramatised, whether it's on radio, TV, or film. Yeah, just that would be wonderful. Yeah, I've been asked before about who would play the characters of Mackenzie and Scoogle. And sadly, I think my initial choice of Sir Sean Connery, that's no longer going to be the case. So who else do we have? I'm trying to remember other Scottish actors who could play him. Scoogle, I think is more difficult. Maybe some new talent could come in and play him. It would be fascinating to see them brought to the screen. Is there a role for Sam Heughan? I don't know, possibly, but yeah, he's maybe a bit too good looking for either characters. Thanks for that one. What tensions do you see in the era of the book that are still apparent today in Scotland? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we're still dealing with many of the same issues that are around just now. The one that's most obvious is the political one, the relationship between Scotland and England, and how that develops. At the time, there was an attempt at union in 1689, the previous year, and it's a continuing subject, that relationship between the two countries, and we're obviously still debating that issue. It's still very much a live issue. I mean, other issues in this particular book. This one is concerned very much with I think mental illness, and which are described in different terms in the 17th century. It would be described as melancholia, and would be seen often in terms of the absence of the presence of God in someone's life. So this one is about these kind of issues, depression and mental health issues, which we're still debating today. And also this one, I hadn't realised so much until an early reader commented that the book was written about the same time as the Me Too movement was developing, and it is concerned with issues of misogyny and violence against women. So yeah, I mean, all these issues are still live issues. So I think crime fiction, historical fiction, it's influenced by the debate in the present. It's not just a stale genre. Thanks for that. I think maybe we should move on to the prize draw just now, if that's okay. I think something should happen on the screen. Here we go. There we go. Well, congratulations, Jenny Neal. Congratulations, you're the lucky winner of the new edition of the first 4 books and the new cover design, which are coming out very soon. So congratulations, Jenny, and thanks for pre-ordering the new book. I should say that the new rebrand of the series with a kind of common design theme looks really good. So we'll have a kind of 5 volume set, which will make a very good present at any time, etc. That's great. Thanks very much. Let's have a look at some other questions. Where are we? Which authors would you say have influenced your writing? Yeah, I mean, I've tended to be the kind of books I read are kind of wide variety. I mean, I read poetry, fiction, history, crime fiction. The crime writers I kind of have enjoyed of late. There's a writer called Philip Kerr, who's a fellow Edinburgher, who writes about crime fiction in Nazi Germany, which I'm enjoying those. It's I think as I am going back, obviously, Sherlock Holmes is probably a major figure. Conan Doyle and all crime writers. It's difficult to kind of work out which ones have actually influenced me. I mean, I tended to read a lot of Scottish literature, Robert Louis Stevenson, Walter Scott when I was younger, Neil Gunn, and then over the last 10, 15 years, I've read a lot of crime fiction. I mean, I tend to prefer personally crime writers who move about geographically and in time. So C.J. Sansom back to the Tudors and those kind of writers. But yeah, and I tend to read anything, so I don't know what's influenced me. Probably Doctor Who as a kid, big influence. Old horror films, Hammer House of Horror, and the classics, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Werewolf. I couldn't get enough of those films when I was a young boy. So they've probably had a deeper influence, but these days I just like it. I like anything. I love just moving about. The great thing about crime fiction and genre fiction is the power of the narrative. So you really, there are books that need to draw you in and take you through the story, whereas literary fiction often tends to confuse and bamboozle. Which if you're in the right mood, that can be great. So yeah, anything at all. How was he murdered, with a dirk or by force? I presume this is referring to the present book. I'll maybe just say he was pretty viciously stabbed, and yeah, I won't talk any more about that. As you can get more details in the book. Thanks very much. Great. Has anyone got any other questions that they want to fire through? That made some great questions tonight. Thanks very much. It's a slightly unusual format, and obviously I can't see anyone's faces, so it's still to get that kind of audience feedback. But it's been a real pleasure to have this virtual launch, and if anyone has got another question, just fire it through just now. Otherwise, we'll probably begin to wrap up. I don't see any other ones coming through. But yeah, thanks everyone. I've enjoyed it tremendously. Please do go and order a copy of the book on the Lewis website and leave a review if you enjoy it. And thank you all very much indeed. Gavin, do you want to come back in there?
Hi there. Yeah, thanks, Dougie. That was really fascinating, and I got a good glimpse into 17th century Scotland, just on which actor I'd go for. Ian Bremner. I think he did a brilliant job. Something completely different for that. Yeah. So just do you want to just very briefly say a little bit more about the books that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, so yeah, the sixth Mackenzie, we've reached the year 1691, and it's a slightly different location. We're moving to the west, to Glasgow and to Lanarkshire and Hamilton. Mackenzie is asked by the Duchess of Hamilton, a major figure in the late 17th century, to investigate the drowning of a young woman. And Scougal accompanies him to the west on business for Mrs. Hare, so the adventure starts there. And for me personally, I mean, the one after that, 1692, is really a big year for me, because I've always been fascinated by the Massacre of Glencoe. And I'm not saying that Scougal and Mackenzie are responsible for that particular massacre, but certainly that event will be part of another book, and I'm quite excited about both these books. It's fascinating to look at Glasgow in the 17th century, which is a booming metropolis, much smaller than Edinburgh, but a very interesting place, and relations to the Caribbean economy and to Quakers and to strange clubs and associations. So that's the kind of subjects that the next Mackenzie will deal with.
Excellent. No, thanks. Right. So just to wrap up. So if people want to buy the book and the earlier books in the series, they can either do it from the Lewis website, or certainly in Edinburgh, a number of the bookshops are doing click and collect or mail order. So there's Toppings, and there's Lighthouse Bookshop, there's Portobello Bookshop, there's Golden Hare, and the Edinburgh bookshops. So they all are doing click and collect. So thanks again to Douglas, and thanks to Lauren, and thank you all for coming, and hopefully we can have an in-person event relating to the book or books in the not too distant future. Okay, night everybody.
Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.